I am Clara, and I will tell you how it all began. When I received the news that our grandparents' old house was now ours, a mix of emotions washed over me. You know that bittersweet feeling of revisiting a place that holds so many memories, yet seems to have stood still in time? That's exactly how I felt as I gazed at the enormous old house covered in ivy. It had been years since anyone had set foot there, and the peeling paint on the walls told its own story of neglect. My siblings, Michael and Sarah, were with me in that moment. Each of us reacted differently, as always. Michael, the most pragmatic, was already talking about the work ahead of us. It's going to cost a fortune to restore this place, he said, mentally calculating the expenses. He had always been like that, which often annoyed me, but it also brought a certain sense of security. Sarah, the dreamer, could barely contain her excitement. For her, every corner of the house was an invitation to relive childhood days and start life anew as an adventure. But I felt something different. Being there in the house that raised us, where Sunday lunches felt endless and filled with laughter, made me realize how far we had drifted apart. Not just from the place, but from each other. I knew that restoring the house wouldn't just be about fixing bricks and painting walls. It would be an attempt to mend our own family, to reconnect. When we entered, the house was filled with dust and silence. Light filtered through the dusty windows, illuminating the old furniture covered in white sheets, as if they had been waiting for us all along. I stood still in the doorway, watching my siblings' faces. Even amidst the decay, it was impossible to ignore how much that place still meant to us. Each room seemed to hold a secret, a hidden memory, as if the ghosts of the past were lurking, ready to reveal themselves. And it was during the first night of cleaning that something strange happened. Michael and Sarah had already gone upstairs to sleep, but I stayed behind to organize some boxes in the basement. That's when I heard a faint sound, like something loosening from a wall. Upon closer inspection, I noticed that a plank of wood was loose. Curious, I pulled at the plank, and there, behind a layer of dust and cobwebs, I found a letter. It was carefully folded, with ink faded by time. On the envelope was a date from decades ago and a name I didn't recognize. My heart raced. What did it mean? I still didn't know, but somehow, I sensed that this letter wouldn't be the only thing we'd find. Perhaps after all, that house held more secrets than we ever imagined. And I was about to discover them. I decided not to open the letter that night. I tucked it into my pocket and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. I kept thinking about what might be inside, and the unknown name on the envelope wouldn't leave my mind. The next morning, I told my siblings about the letter. Sarah, of course, was thrilled. She loved family mysteries, as if it were one of those tales of forbidden romance she read so much in her youth. Michael, on the other hand, barely paid attention. Probably just some old correspondence. It doesn't matter, he said. But I felt it did, and so did Sarah. She insisted we open the letter at breakfast. Eventually we gave in. When we unfolded the old paper, the elegant and careful handwriting filled my eyes with a strange sensation. The letter was signed by our grandmother, but it wasn't addressed to our grandfather. It was for someone named James, a name we had never heard before. Silence fell heavily among us as Sarah read aloud, and right from the start, we sensed that the relationship between them was anything but platonic. There was something deeper there. The letter was filled with emotion. Our grandmother spoke of longing, of secret meetings, and the struggle of living a life in which she couldn't be with him. The weight of that silence was palpable. Michael crossed his arms and let out a sigh. This can't be serious. Our grandmother loved Grandpa. Everyone knew that. But I saw something in his eyes. Even if he didn't want to admit it, that letter troubled him just as much as it did us. Sarah, in contrast, seemed lost in thought, as if she were trying to piece together a much larger puzzle. As we reread the letter, we began to understand that the relationship between our grandmother and this James was more than a simple affair. The letter spoke of difficult decisions, of the choice she had to make between the love she felt for him and the life she had already built with our family. She mentioned that Grandpa never knew about James, and that this secret was buried with her. I felt torn. Part of me wanted to believe that it changed nothing, that our grandmother was still the same strong and loving woman I had always known. But another part couldn't help but wonder, what else had she hidden from us? How could this relationship have changed our lives without us ever knowing? The rest of the day was enveloped in a strange silence. I could see Michael trying to bury it, pretending it didn't matter. But Sarah couldn't stop talking about what the letter meant, and me. Well, I found myself increasingly caught in the mystery we had just uncovered. I felt as if, somehow, That piece of paper had opened a door to a past that had long been locked away. That night, after Michael went to bed, Sarah and I found ourselves in the living room. She was flipping through one of the old photo albums. "Clara," she began, "do you think we can find more letters? Or diaries, anything that explains what really happened?" I knew she was right. The house was large, filled with hiding places we had never truly explored. If our grandmother kept this secret for so long, maybe there was more hidden there. And deep down, I knew I wouldn't be able to rest until I uncovered what else our family was hiding. That night, Sarah and I talked late into the evening. We decided that the next day we would start searching for more clues. It was strange to think that we grew up in that house and never imagined it could hold so many secrets. Sarah seemed excited by the idea, but I don't know, there was something unsettling about it. The more we discovered, the more I felt we were stirring something that perhaps should remain buried. But, as always, my curiosity won out. The next morning, we began to truly explore the house. No longer as children playing hide and seek, but as investigators. We rummaged through old trunks, drawers we hadn't touched in years, and then in the closet of our grandparents' bedroom, we found something unexpected, a diary. It was well hidden, beneath a pile of old clothes that probably hadn't been disturbed in decades. The notebook was old, with a leather cover, and the pages were yellowed. I felt a chill run down my spine when I realized that this likely contained more truths than we were ready to face. But, of course, Sarah didn't hesitate. She opened the diary to the first page and began to read. Our grandmother wrote about the beginning of her married life, about how she met our grandfather, and how, in the beginning, everything seemed perfect. But as Sarah flipped through the pages, the tone of the entries began to change. Amid records of family gatherings and trips, mentions of James began to appear. The man from the letter. She spoke of secret meetings, of a love she had never felt for our grandfather. And suddenly, everything we thought we knew about our family began to crumble. There was more. In one of the entries, our grandmother wrote about the most difficult decision of her life. She was pregnant. But the baby wasn't our grandfather's. I remember the exact moment when Sarah read that aloud. The room seemed to shrink. The air felt heavier. Michael walked in just then and saw us with the diary in our hands. He looked at us as if he wanted to pretend nothing was happening, but he could tell from our faces that it was serious. "What now?" he asked impatiently. Sarah, still in shock, handed the diary to him. "Read for yourself," was all she could say. I watched Michael quickly skim through the pages, his expression changing as he absorbed what our grandmother had written. "This can't be true," he finally said, more to himself than to us. This changes everything." And in a way it did. If what was written there was true, it meant that one of our parents wasn't who we thought they were. Our roots, our history, everything felt like it was collapsing around us. And amidst all this, I felt lost, trying to make sense of it. How could the woman who seemed to be the pillar of our family have lived with so many secrets? Michael, as always, tried to end the discussion. "We should stop this now. That's enough. The house, the diary, all of it. It's only going to bring more trouble." But I knew that, no matter how much he wanted to escape, we couldn't go back. Something had been opened inside me. A piece of our history that needed to be understood. And I was determined to see it through. Michael left the room, clearly shaken, but as usual, trying to maintain the facade that everything was under control. I could see in his eyes that the weight of those words affected him deeply, but, as was typical, he didn't want to talk about it. Sarah sat on the floor, holding the diary as if it were a sacred artifact. I knew she was trying to process everything too. I decided it was time to pause for a moment, to give ourselves a bit of breathing room, but the tension between us was growing. That house, which had once felt like a childhood refuge, was now filled with uncertainties. I couldn't stop thinking that this secret about our grandparents' past could directly impact who we were, or at least who we thought we were. It was the following night, while I was trying to organize my own thoughts, that Michael called me to talk. He seemed nervous, something that rarely happened with him. We went to our grandfather's office, one of the least explored rooms in the house, surrounded by dusty books and dark wooden furniture that creaked with every movement. "Clara," he began, running his hand through his hair, "this all needs to stop." I knew he was talking about the diary, about the letters. He'd always been the practical one, the one who preferred to ignore problems rather than face them. "We're digging into things that will only make our family messy, eh? Isn't what's happened in the last few years enough?" I understood his concern. Our family wasn't exactly perfect, and we'd already faced our share of crises. But this was different. These were our grandparents, the foundation of our story. I couldn't simply ignore what we had discovered. Michael, I started, trying to remain calm. This isn't just about the past. These discoveries affect who we are, what we believe. We can't just pretend we didn't find these letters and this diary. He shook his head, frustrated. And what does it change, Clara? What's it going to solve now? Knowing that Grandma had an affair and that things weren't perfect is only going to make things worse between us. You're always trying to keep the family together, but you don't see that this could tear us apart. Those words hit me like a punch. I had always been the mediator, the one who kept the peace among everyone. And he was right. Part of me knew that insisting on unearthing the past could push our family to the brink. But at the same time, I felt that there was no turning back. We had opened a door, and walking through it was the only option. I'm not trying to destroy anything, I replied, more firmly. But ignoring this won't save us. Our grandparents made choices that impacted all of us, and we have the right to know the truth. You may not care, but I do. He looked at me for a long time, as if trying to decide what to say next. You want to be the hero who fixes everything, Clara. But sometimes you can't fix what's broken. And with that, he left the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I stayed there for a while, staring at the dusty books, trying to absorb it all. I was tired of being the peacemaker, of carrying the weight of holding our family together. Maybe Michael was right. Maybe I was forcing something that couldn't be fixed. But at the same time, I felt I could no longer ignore the secrets that were being revealed. This was about so much more than letters and diaries. It was about who we were. Later that same night, Sarah found me in the office. She seemed calmer, but her eyes still reflected the confusion we were all feeling. She sat down next to me, silent for a few minutes. Clara, she said softly, maybe we need to know the truth. Maybe it's not what we expected, but how can we move forward without understanding what really happened? I knew she was right. Something inside me said that continuing to uncover these secrets was the only way to deal with it all. But I also knew that once we delved deeper, there would be no turning back. The next morning, everything was more tense. Michael barely spoke to me or to Sarah. I knew that, deep down, he was also processing everything, but that was his way, to distance himself when things got complicated. As we were having coffee, Sarah brought the journal out again, opening it to the page we hadn't managed to read the night before. I think we need to finish reading this, she said, hesitant yet determined. I nodded in agreement, while Michael remained silent, staring into his coffee, pretending not to hear. Sarah began to read aloud. Our grandmother described the moment she made the hardest decision of her life. The journal spoke of her pregnancy. Not with our grandfather, but with James. She described the panic, the fear of destroying the life she had built, the shame of carrying such a heavy secret. And then came the revelation that changed everything. Our grandmother decided not to stay with James, nor to keep the baby. She wrote about the moment she handed her child over for adoption. The aching heart, the muffled cries, and the emptiness that remained. She knew that by doing this, she was sacrificing her true love and the chance for happiness in a way that would never be possible with our grandfather. But for her, preserving the honor of the family and maintaining what she had built seemed more important than following her heart. When Sarah finished reading, the room was enveloped in complete silence. It felt as if the world had stopped. I could barely process the idea that we had a family member we had never known, a brother or sister of one of our parents, lost forever. My mind spun with questions and doubts. Who was this child? Where were they now? What did this mean for us? Michael was the first to break the silence. He stood up abruptly and began to pace the room, visibly shaken. This is crazy, he said, almost laughing nervously. You're saying Grandma had another child and just gave it away? And now what do we do with this information? Do we look for them? Do we pretend this never happened? This doesn't make sense. I felt the weight of those questions, but unlike Michael, I didn't believe we could pretend that this was all unreal. Sarah looked at me, waiting for me to say something, and for a moment, I felt the heavy burden of responsibility on my shoulders. Michael, I said, trying to stay calm, this changes everything. We have the right to know. There's a part of our family that has been hidden from us, a story we never knew. And yes, it affects us. Maybe we shouldn't look for this person, but we also can't just ignore it. Michael shook his head, frustrated. What if this only complicates things more? Don't we already have enough problems? I don't want to get more involved in this, Clara. That hurt me, but I understood. He had always been the more practical one, wanting to keep things running smoothly without drama, without complications. But I could no longer ignore it. And I knew Sarah felt the same way. It was as if that house and everything we had uncovered was pulling us towards a greater truth, something we needed to face. I'm going to find out more, I finally said. I don't know how, but I'm going to investigate. If you don't want to get involved, that's okay. But I can't just leave this behind anymore. Michael looked at me for a moment, his eyes filled with a mix of frustration and resignation. I knew he didn't agree, but deep down, perhaps he understood that I wouldn't change my mind. Later, alone in my room, I reflected on everything we had discovered. Our grandmother's decision had not been easy. She sacrificed so much to maintain appearances, to protect something she believed was more important than her own heart. And I wondered if I was making the same mistake. Was I sacrificing my own wants and dreams to keep our family united? Always trying to be the pillar, the bridge between Michael and Sarah, keeping everything in balance? I knew our journey in that house was far from over. But for the first time, I began to question my own sacrifices. Perhaps it was time to think about myself. In the days that followed, the atmosphere between us remained heavy. Michael grew increasingly distant while Sarah and I spent hours poring over our grandmother's diaries, trying to find more clues. It was hard to know how to act with everything we had discovered. Each new page read brought more questions, but also more clarity about the secret life our grandmother had led. One night, while Sarah and I were in the living room, the phone rang. It was Michael, calling from the room he was in, something he rarely did. He asked us to meet him in our grandfather's office. I knew he didn't want to deal with all of this, but the tone in his voice indicated there was something he needed to discuss. We went there. He was sitting in the large leather chair, looking lost in thought. He glanced at us and then spoke. I've been thinking about all of this. And Clara, Sarah, I understand why you want to continue. I understand why you think we need to know the truth, to find out what happened to this child. But what will that give us? Do you think finding this person will help us fix anything? Sarah and I exchanged glances. We knew there were no guarantees. But for me, it was no longer just about finding someone. It was about finally confronting everything that had been hidden, not just from our family, but from ourselves. Michael, I began calmly, it's not just about finding this person. It's about understanding where we come from, what our grandparents really went through. You're afraid this will destroy what's left of our family. But hiding the truth is what started all this. Our grandmother lived a life that was never completely her own. Don't you think we deserve to know who we really are? He sighed deeply, resting his head in his hands. I don't know, Clara. I feel like we're stirring up something that shouldn't be touched. But at the same time, I can't stop thinking about it. What does this really mean for us? What does it mean for me? Sarah, who had been quiet until then, stepped forward. Michael, we're all confused. But this isn't the first time our family has kept secrets. Look at what happened with our parents. All the fights, the lies. We always thought we knew everything, but this house has shown us that the truth always finds a way to surface. I saw something shift in Michael's gaze. He was torn between wanting to maintain peace and diving deeper into the storm we were facing. I knew he wanted to protect the little that remained of our family, but I realized that, perhaps for the first time, he was considering that knowing the truth might be the only way forward. The silence that followed was long, until he finally spoke, his voice weary and sincere. Okay, if this is what you both think we should do, I'll go with you. But please, promise me that if this starts to destroy us, we'll stop. I don't want to lose anyone else. I felt a weight lifted off my shoulders. He wasn't ready to lead this journey, but at least now he was willing to face it alongside us. With Michael finally on our side, we decided how to proceed. First, we would look for clues about the child our grandmother gave up for adoption. Sarah, always the most optimistic, believed we could follow some trail. I, on the other hand, felt fear. Not of not finding answers, but of discovering that the truth could be more painful than we expected. After that conversation, something inside me began to change. For the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to think about my own choices, not just as the mediator of the family, but as Clara, the person who was also lost in this story. That night, before going to bed, I opened our grandmother's diary once more, searching for a sign, something that could give me the strength I needed. In one of the last entries, she wrote something that echoed in my mind. Underscore sometimes, keeping the family together means losing pieces of yourself. But other times, it means having the courage to let them go. Underscore that hit me deeply. For the first time, I questioned whether all the effort to keep things together, to hold our family up, was worth the sacrifice of who I was. Maybe our grandmother had lived her entire life making sacrifices for others, and now I was faced with the same choice. In that moment, something solidified within me. I was no longer willing to carry all the weight alone. With Michael now on our side, things felt different. There was a kind of resolution in the air, as if we were finally ready to face whatever came our way. The house, with all its secrets and shadows, no longer frightened us in the same way. It was as if we had accepted that the truth needed to be confronted, no matter how difficult it might be. That morning, we decided to sit down together to discuss our next step. Michael, always the practical one, suggested we search for documents regarding the adoption. Perhaps somewhere in the house, there were clues about who this child was and where he might be now. Sarah, as always, was hopeful, believing that somehow finding this person would bring some healing to what our family had endured. I, however, felt divided. Part of me wanted to move forward, to unearth every secret and find all the answers. But another part, perhaps the more weary one, questioned whether digging into the past was the right thing to do. I knew we had already uncovered so much, and that more truths could bring even more pain. But one thing was clear. We could no longer stop. We spent the day rummaging through the house, searching for any record, any document that could provide us with more information about the adoption. In the middle of the afternoon, Michael found a folder hidden at the back of the office cabinet, filled with yellowed papers and old stamps. It was a series of legal documents, and among them, we found what we were looking for: the adoption paperwork. There was a name. A new shock. The child was a boy. My heart tightened as I read that information. We had an uncle, someone we had never met, someone who was part of our story but had been erased from it by a decision our grandmother made years ago. The document indicated the city to which he had been taken, but beyond that, there was little to follow. The lead was there, but it was fragile. Michael, contrary to what I expected, was the first to speak. "We need to go after him," he said firmly. The skepticism he had before seemed to have vanished, replaced by an urgency I hadn't seen in him until then. If this man is still out there, if he is still part of who we are, we have to find him. Sarah, always the emotional one, already had tears in her eyes. She agreed immediately, almost as if she had been waiting for this moment since we found the first letter. But I remained silent. Something inside me hesitated. "Clara?" Michael called, waiting for me to say something. I took a deep breath before responding. What if this doesn't bring the answers we hope for? What if this person doesn't even want to meet us? We know nothing about the life he led. Do we have the right to intrude now? The silence that followed was heavy. We knew that any decision had the potential to change everything. I wanted more than anything for this journey to have a clear and redemptive end. But I also knew that life rarely gives us perfect conclusions. It was then that Sarah, with her sensitivity, said something that touched me deeply. "Clara, maybe the answer isn't about finding him or not. Maybe what's more important is what we learn along the way. This house, these secrets, they have changed us. They forced us to confront who we are, and maybe, just that is enough." She was right. The truth was that, by uncovering these secrets, I was no longer the same person who had entered that house at the beginning. The weight of trying to keep the family together, of being the mediator, of carrying everyone else's expectations, was finally beginning to lift. Perhaps the most important thing was that, for the first time, I was ready to let myself be who I truly am, without trying to fix everything around me. I looked at my siblings, and for the first time in a long time, I felt we were in the same place. Michael was no longer distant and practical. Sarah was not just a dreamer. We three, together, were ready to move forward, no matter what happened from there. "Let's try," I finally said. "But let's do it together. And whatever we find, we face it together." That decision brought us an unexpected peace. We knew the future was still uncertain, and that the search for our uncle might be more complicated than we imagined. But for the first time, we were willing to face that uncertainty without the burden of the secrets that had held us back. When we left that house a few days later, I felt we were leaving behind not only the ghosts of the past but also the parts of ourselves that no longer served us. The house remained, but it was no longer the place where our secrets were buried. Now, it was a symbol of everything we had faced together. As we walked to the car, I felt a lightness I hadn't felt in a long time. We didn't know.
Hi, you are on the Moving Narratives channel. Subscribe and follow our stories.